All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this session of macroeconomics hours. Hadi and I are happy that you're joining us. Hadi hopefully will join us soon. Something held him up by the looks of it. So today we'll be talking about the role of the United States dollar in global markets. There has been a few good articles that were published lately on the subject, including a really nice article from The Economist. And so let's dive in and let's talk about this topic a little bit more. So our approach here was that Hadi would talk about the theoretical foundations. Hadi is a little bit late, and again, hopefully he'll join us soon. So then I'll talk about the concept of the petrodollar, the impact potentially of the war in Iran, the criticisms that exist of the petrodollar concept and alternative explanations of the US dollar's global dominance. And there's probably not going to be a lot of terribly surprising things in this discussion, but let's start digging into the idea of the petrodollar. Again, these are some of the fun readings that we've identified for you. I also really recommend Barry Eichengreen's book about called exorbitant privilege, right? And that's a term that gets used very, very often, which refers to American dollar's privilege of being able to attract high demand for it quickly and serving as the world's reserve currency, essentially, right? But let's start with the concept of the petrodollar. So this concept was introduced in 1970s, and it corresponded, obviously, to the increase in oil prices once the oil producers got together and established OPEC. The idea of the petrodollar runs something like this. So oil is priced in dollars. And there is actually a lot of discussions about the role of of an agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States in the early 1970s, where they established the concept that purchases of oil have to be paid for by United States dollars only. Which was a bit of a surprise to the Brits, who expected that there would be at least the alternative of paying for oil in British pounds, right? And so if oil is priced in dollars, that means United States pays dollars to Gulf oil exporters, so do other countries. And so other countries have to buy dollars, and that creates demand for dollars, essentially. That increases that demand. For the Gulf oil economies, they'll accumulate those dollars. They'll use some of it for their own countries, right? And a lot of those countries also tie their exchange rates in a fixed way to the United States dollar, right? But then those surplus funds are basically recycled back to the Western financial markets. And there was a good amount of criticism that in 1970s, a lot of this money traveled back to the United States, and then it actually traveled to Latin America, and that it actually contributed to a number of economic crises and boom bust cycles in Latin America as well, right? But a lot of this would be recycling, like buying treasury bonds, right? For example, there are some stories about Saudi Arabia basically purchasing treasury bonds from the United States, but keeping those transactions in secret because they couldn't be viewed as supporting essentially an ally of Israel in something like that, right? And so, for a while, Saudi Arabia kept significant deposits in treasuries, right? Significant amount of money in their treasuries, and that wasn't really known by anyone, right? And so, a lot of conspiracy theorists actually like that story quite a bit. It's an enjoyable story, I have to say. But the outcome of this concept of petrodollar is as follows. So essentially, what we are doing here is creating demand for US dollars. If the demand for dollars increases, that means that the value of the dollar will increase and the dollar will appreciate, right? Compared to other currencies. And a lot also of those, a lot of those dollars will essentially stay somewhere and create demand for US dollar denominated assets. And so this could be things like treasury bonds. This could be things like mortgage-based securities. This could be other assets like you could invest in the stock market. You can invest in real estate market. And we know that some locations like New York and San Francisco and LA, there is a lot of real estate that is owned by foreigners, by the foreign residents as well, right? And so this also allows the United States to borrow relatively cheaply, right? And the impact is driving up asset prices, actually. And with that in mind, so that's basically what the concept of the petrodollar is. Oh, and I can see that Hadi joined us. Hadi, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you. Let me know when you're ready to present the theoretical foundation here. Probably best if you do
You
that, and then I
you
continue.
you're doing very well. So let's continue, and then if I
Okay,
see my
okay,
presentation fits,
okay.
I'll discuss some of it.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Excellent. And so basically the end result of this process, right, is essentially United States dollar being used as a global reserve currency of sorts, right? Or at least this is how the concept of the petrodollar was viewed more. But there has obviously been some cracks in this model for a number of reasons, and we'll discuss them a little later. And one of those cracks is kind of like coming up in the discussion of what the impact of the war in Iran on the petrodollar framework is going to be. And so the idea here of this criticism is that, well, look, sort of the Gulf oil countries' customers are shifting. So because of the Strait of Hormuz being closed and being problematic, we are seeing those Gulf oil economies supplying more oil to Asia, supplying less oil to the Western countries. At the very same time, keep in mind that United States is actually a lot more dependent on its own oil right now, right? Because it basically produces more oil than anybody else in the world, including Saudi Arabia, thanks to the advances in technologies in shale oil extraction and such. So there is also the idea that many countries, as a result, so that applies to China, to Russia, to India, settle oil trade in their own currencies. For example, India might pay Russia in rupees, right? And so then those rupees might be used to buy assets in India. They could be used to buy other things in India and export them back to Russia. And same applies to China, basically trading with the Gulf oil nations, buying their oil, right? And sort of that basically means that, hey, if that's the case, and if you're seeing those fundamental shifts happening, do we expect to see a significant erosion? I mean, I think it's not, just the issue of potential erosion, because that potential is there, but is there significant erosion in this petrodollar's dominance? And should it be, essentially replacing the petrodollar by the petro-yuan, right? And that's a valid question to ask. But here are a few good responses to that question. And those responses will all probably start with the phrase, well, not so fast, right? So, okay, it would be nice to have options to pay in different currencies. That's perfectly fine. However, deals could actually be still priced in dollars. You could just pay for those deals in different currencies based on the current exchange rate, right? Sort of that is still a settlement possibility. It's possible and likely that yuan is going to gain some ground as percent of that share in transaction. But even with all of the expansion in that we see, it's probably not still going to account for more than 10% of total, in the next 5 years from now, right? And in 5 years from now, hopefully, things are going to settle down a little bit in the Gulf region, right? So companies who all use oil will also price their outputs in dollars, because that kind of serves as a hedge in currency fluctuations. Because if your, sort of expenses are in dollars and your income is in dollars, that kind of allows you to kind of match those things against each other. But one criticism of that is that, look, but oil prices fluctuate too, and they also respond to the changes in dollars, right? Sort of if the dollar essentially gets cheaper, it's very likely that the oil prices are actually going to adjust upwards, right? And so if that's the case, then this is really not necessarily a defense to this, not necessarily a hedging tactic or an effective hedging tactic to respond to those exchange rate fluctuations. And then there is yet another argument that says, look at the data. Sure, if you looked at the 1970s, oil producers had huge current account surpluses, right? But since then, in many, many years, and cumulatively, those have not necessarily been quite as high as I think they are, or in some cases they even turn to deficits. If you look at 2025 and you look at all of the Gulf economies and some related economies, you're basically seeing maybe a combined surplus of $200 billion, which again is a huge number, but it's not as large as it seems to be. If you look at the equivalent surplus for Asian manufacturers, that's much larger. That's 1.5 trillion that we're seeing there, right? Sort of this is, what is it, seven times, more than seven times, actually more than that, right? Sort of that's a, that's a lot more. No, it's about 10 times, right? Sort of it's a lot more significant. No, seven times is still right. I can't do my mental math today, apparently. And so from that perspective, explaining the dollar dominance by the petrodollar concept kind of becomes a little more challenging. And so then, sort of like we have to think about what the alternative explanations might be, right? And the alternative explanations, there's a stronger explanations in my opinion, and they are fairly logical and relatively easy to understand. Number one, dollar still remains safest asset in the world. And why might be the case? Well, if you look at the capital markets in the United States, they're exceptional in terms of their depth and liquidity, right? So like the only sets of capital markets that come close to that would probably be, European Union, dominated by Germany, right? United Kingdom, potentially, even the United Kingdom capital markets have become weaker in the past years, right? United States still does pretty well in this. In terms of the property rights protection, United States ranks very, very high. It doesn't rank uniformly high on every single component of property rights. For example, it does better in intellectual property right protection compared to some of the other rights. And then there is also differences in the states, right, sort of in their regulatory regime. So it's not necessarily even across the entire country, but still pretty high. So we've talked about the depth and liquidity, and the examples of those very liquid dollar-denominated assets would be things like treasury bonds, like mortgage-based securities, which have been cleaned up quite a bit since the crisis in 2007, 2008, right? This would be the money market funds that promise you to retain the value of your assets, and they consistently trade at $1 each. And so if you put $1 into the money market funds, you should be able to take that dollar right out, and you might potentially have some dividend income from the interest paid on the securities that that mutual fund is buying, right? So then think about the network effects of using dollars in global transactions, right? So economies of network or network effects in economics are similar to the economies of scale. And the idea here is that the more that you see of invoicing, borrowing, payments, commodity pricing, derivative pricing done in dollars, the greater incentive it provides to any of the new transaction to use dollars for that pricing as well, right? Sort of this is kind of, you can think about that as the concept of the dominant currency pricing, essentially. Then on top of that, what matters, and that is a point relevant to the property rights protections, is having the right institutions and the rule of law that essentially guarantees to the investors that if things go south for them, they don't go terribly south, right? In many countries like China, like Russia, your property is nowhere near quite as safe as it is in the United States. If there is a politically motivated prosecution, you could lose your assets very, very quickly. In the United States, you still have to go through the justice system. Justice system is still relatively impartial, and that helps make sure that owners of those assets are protected. They do really well, and that attracts even more people to the United States. And so to me, it's probably the combination of those three things that provide the best possible explanation. This is not to say that the concept of the petrodollar is bunk, right? It's not. It's been a very good explanation in the 1970s and the 1980s, but since then the oil markets changed. We've seen the movements of goods and services from manufacturing Asia to the developed economies take significant volume. That in many cases is much larger than the volume of oil trade, right? And as a result of all, and as a result of all of those developments and the protections that the United States established for investors, this is why United States remains that destination for global international investing. And that's basically what I had. So, which we run through in about 20 minutes, which is great. I tend to be wordier than that. But let me stop sharing and pass it on and open it for questions and comments from Hadi as well.
See. Vivian says that she starts to doubt the level of predictability of the legal system in the US. And I think that's a very important point.
Mhm,
Not just the legal system, but the stability of policymaking generally in the
mhm,
US.
mhm. And I think that's an excellent point, right? That's something to be concerned about because if that's the legal system that's been protecting the dominance of the US dollar as the world's global currency, so that could be taken away from. I think in many ways, however, they are still lucky because despite some of the changes in the executive branch and in the way how the executive and the legislative branch interact with each other, and the continue, and the dominance of a current dominance of one party, those things could change, right? At the very same time, the justice system, the wheels tend to move very slow, rather slow, right? Not excessively slowly. It's not as bad as India, where it could take 10 years for something to be heard. Generally speaking, justice system is not working instantaneously in the United States, but it's working, relatively okay compared to many other countries, right? And so when actions take place that might threaten the property rights, the justice system serves effectively as that third check on sort of on that triumvirate of legislative, executive, and judicial power in the United States, and it does what the framers of the Constitution expect it to do. Will it continue doing that in the future? I'm highly, I think that it's highly likely that it will continue doing so. We obviously can't predict every single thing, but still, that could be but still, that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? Folks, I know there has been a few comments in the chat, so I encourage you to unmute yourself and ask those questions live.
Sure, sure. First, it's maybe a comment, right? What contributed to other countries selling in their own currencies? I guess it was a seizure of other countries' assets nominated in dollars, which
Uh-huh.
scared the other country, right? So it started with Russia, maybe for good reasons. It's
Mm-hmm.
arguable, right? But other countries got scared, right? Then, like, why
Mm-hmm.
China should keep their reserves in US dollars, right? If
Mm-hmm.
there might be a threat or a similar thing. So it's more just a comment that other factors contribute to it. Another thing was that I think in general, for the reserve currency, there are three pillars, right? First, the kind of exchange tool, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in what currency you do the settlement of payments. Another is store of value, and number three, accounting unit, right? And all of them kind of contribute to each other, right? If you have a surplus in dollars, you might want to keep them in dollars and invest in
Mm-hmm.
dollars. So it's store of value and so on. So falling in one category can lead to the falling in all the other categories, contributing to the like settling down of
Mm-hmm.
the US dollar being the world reserve currency.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are excellent points. And sort of like one of the things obviously that took place post-COVID era is the significant amount of inflation that we've seen that kind of eroded the value of the US dollar as a store of value, right? And so this is one of the reasons, of course, why the Fed is so concerned about that. Fed is trying very hard to establish its credibility as the fighter of inflation. Generally speaking, it's been fairly successful in driving inflation down quite a bit, but not quite to the 2% units. But you're right? Sort of if you're looking at all of those things together, if you look at the changes in the political system and the justice system, it is possible to see the dominance of the US dollar erode, but it would not be just for the reasons related to the oil trade, right? It would be for other reasons, like failures potentially in monetary and fiscal policy, like inability to run balanced budgets, right? Sort of which threaten the country's credibility and the ability to borrow cheaply, because if the United States has to start paying significant premiums on its debt, and people start perceiving those assets as not terribly safe, that's what can hurt dollar a lot more than the changes, than the dynamics in the Middle East related to oil trade.
And the last one was, do you have, maybe it was in those articles you shared before the session,
Mhm.
is there any estimate, like newer estimate that JP Morgan's 2023 estimate of the current share of oil sold in those alternative currencies, right?
Mhm.
That estimate was like 20% in 2023 with all the like Strait of Hormuz changes and so on. Has
Yeah.
it changed? Is it still the same? Do you have any other data?
So I don't have, I'm not aware of any other data that shows kind of like the oil transaction pricing. I can believe 20% quite well, and I can think that it could be higher than that. But then if you look at the trade overall, right, sort of oil trade, not just the oil trade itself, you're probably looking at, Hadi, what would be the estimate? I think probably 88%. Still, it was, yeah, maybe 89% about a year ago in terms of dollar being one of the currency exchange pairs of currencies. It's been above 90% for many years, I think, or close to 90%. It's falling below 90%, but I think overall it hasn't even gone down to 85% or anything like that. It's still a pretty significant presence of the dollar in those transactions.
Hey, Vlad.
Hey, James, go
Hi.
ahead.
I'll just jump in. I mean, we're here, right?
Uh-huh.
My question is as an organization or institutional competitor, is BRICS emerging as a potential substitute for the petrodollar?
Excellent question. Hadi, let me throw this one back to you. What do you think?
I think that BRICS together are not going to make much of a difference. If any change comes, it's going to be coming from China. And Chinese have been trying to shift a lot of transactions towards yuan. That may have some impact long term, but BRICS as an organization, I think, is not that strong of an organization to make a difference. And there's not going to be any currency associated with BRICS. Even if there is one, I don't think it's going to pick some much currency, much interest.
Mhm.
Even euro, which is pretty solid compared to developing country or emerging economies, currencies, it's not has not been able to gain much subscription, not much following.
Mhm.
I see that. This is fantastic to me. Okay. In terms of kind of compositional impact, you're saying that China is the primary force that is driving this competitiveness for BRICS. But
Right.
does does China's ability and therefore BRICS ability to kind of influence maybe neutral nations also impact the ability to settle things in a new currency, and especially in places like the global South? I'm just curious.
Well, what there are a number of factors that give China the opportunity to engage more in currency markets and for yuan to gain interest or gain grounds in the world markets. The key issue here is that China trades a lot with the rest of the world, and therefore its currency can be useful for many countries. And on the other hand, the US has engaged in sanctioning a lot of countries, Iran, Russia, and there are a number of other countries that are sanctioned. And these countries are trading a lot with China, and the use of yuan becomes common in their trade, in their activities. So China prefers to provide yuan as a means of transactions in global, it's in its global exchanges and interactions, and therefore that has provided space for China to grow the role of yuan.
Final question, totally unrelated to all this, was that sorry, it's econ related though, so it's near and dear to the heart of econ people. Is that there was an article I think from the Wall Street Journal that showed that a number of tech companies who were actually integrating AI weren't letting people go, and were in fact hiring more people, which is contrary to the whole like premise that AI is here to replace all of us. And I wrote a quick LinkedIn post on that the reason why this is happening, why it's so contrary to the narrative, is because marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost of those employees. And I was thinking of Vlad right then and there. Anyways, that's it. Those are the questions I had. I wanted just to kind of highlight that.
I think a key thing to keep in mind is that the expenditure on AI is investment.
Exactly. Yes. Not
while
substitute.
the benefits are going to be consumption in the future. So
I think there's the value chain of human plus AI equals a value that's greater than any cost savings of just using AI alone, potentially.
Right.
Anyways, I was thinking of Vlad when I read that article. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, right? I mean, Honey makes a really good point that, sort of what happens right now is kind of investing, right? And so if you view, sort of generative AI as one of those, general purpose technologies, right? Sort of as one of those GPTs, so ChatGPT does have a very prophetic name in many ways. So right now, what we're seeing is that this investment is basically coming in before we're seeing a lot of the benefits of the technology kind of come out, right? Sort of like very similar to what we've seen with the microcomputers, very similar to what we've seen with the microcomputer software, because, for better, or poorer, Microsoft Office basically changed the world in many ways, right? But it took a while for those benefits to start kicking in, because first you have to buy the license to use Microsoft Word. Then you have to send your people to training or do some sort of own training for the organization. Then you have to change your own processes to reflect how things should be done in the future, right? And so this ramp up period takes time and takes money, right? On the macroeconomic level, it can also contribute to the inflation right now as you're building that productive capacity. But once things are flowing, right, once they're widely accepted, once most companies change their processes to reflect that, I think this is when we start seeing real savings. And this is where we could see more realignment between, people and capital usage, right? So again, the outcome probably is going to be in some way similar to what we've seen to the other outcomes before. There's going to be a subset of people who will do a lot better than everybody else because they're becoming proficient users and engineers and architects of using artificial intelligence. And some people might be falling behind, right? And, sort of like, and very often, sort of like it happens that, those losses and those gains will be concentrated amongst different groups of employees and potential employees. So we'll still have to see how this goes. But in consumption, there is that promise of artificial intelligence contributing to lowering the inflation quite a bit. And our new chairman of the Federal Reserve, I guess he doesn't like to be called chair anymore compared to his predecessor. He believes that this is indeed something that helps Fed not to pursue policies in the face of inflation that are quite as contractionary as they could be. All excellent points. Thank you, James.
Yeah, and to the point of the new Fed chair, Mark Andreessen is one of the advisors on the
Uh-huh.
technology-related changes of the central bank operations. So he's a UIC graduate. This is good. He hates UIC. This is not so good. Yeah, still, I think good news.
Yeah, that was a big fight at the university for the intellectual property rights, right? Sort of
Yep.
something that actually, forced the university to change a number of policies, and a lot of those changes were actually taking place as I joined the school, right? So I think IMBA program took a lot of those things to heart in its own agreements of faculty. So yes, it's interesting news. I know that we're probably not Andreessen's favorite at this point, but on the other hand, I think that he's a fair-minded guy who probably would not do anything to hurt his former alma mater, right?
Yeah.
Silly question. Sorry. What languages? Of course, maybe this could be interpreted as computer languages, but also what languages should one study right now to really be able to pivot and realize the value of machine learning? This is a deep question because obviously Chinese is obviously the standard answer, but I think there's more nuances.
Actually, with AI growing the way it is, this becomes a very tricky question. You don't need to learn any other language.
Okay.
You get instant translation, and you can actually make the tone and the sound and the expression also very, very specific.
I find that true, but it still lacks. Yes, but I think it still lacks like the finesse of the human. Yes, I agreed. Like if I need to say something Japanese, boom, AI does it just fine. But it doesn't mean it says it with the tone and what I'm really thinking in mind and all that other stuff. So I'm just curious to know.
Connotations.
Yes, yeah, and cultural
Right.
meanings also.
Cultural, but even that, maybe we can train AI to give us an impression of how it feels to hear this word, the certain set of words.
But in terms of, let's say, an international business perspective, what languages should we study so that we can, create the most value for people? I'm curious.
That's a very good point.
And I don't know, I quite know the answer to that question. But I do want to say is that, sort of AI made a lot of international transactions easier and less frictionless in terms of, taking away dependence on a certain language, right? So it's been making quite a bit of a difference. And I think just on a very anecdotal basis, we've seen more international students who don't necessarily have a very high command of the English language come to the program and rely quite a bit on those automated translation tools, both for attending and contributing to the live lectures in terms of work on their assignments and deliverables. I can tell you that it's slowly changing our program as well by making it more global. And, obviously there are, arguably rather that there is both good and bad things about that. But I'm excited to see what we'll see in the future there.
Getting back to the petrodollar, maybe. So I know that it's very uneasy and like any forecast on the future of the US dollar as the reserve currency, right? Because in any case, there is a lot of inertia, right? So it will be used for a long time, probably not clear how long this long time is, right? But then suddenly and abruptly, it might be dumped by everyone when they realize that those kind of obligations in dollars are worth much less, if anything, right? And there is a good book by Ray Dalio about the sunrise and sunset of empires, right? And we can see many of those signs right now for the US and China, right? So any ideas? Again, I understand forecasting is not easy, and it's fool's errand, but maybe some ideas. What do you think where it's going, and what's the time frame?
Hadi, you want to start?
Well, my view is that it's the time frame is 10 decade or decades, but the actual change moving from dollars to yuan or other currencies is going to happen very quickly. Because once it becomes clear that the dollar is headed down, financial markets are not going to wait the for the drop in the role of dollar to become realized. They actually do it right there.
Yeah, that's right. Expectations become kind of like self-fulfilling very quickly. What matters is that the great majority of the market participants start embracing them, right? And once they see the signs of others embracing that and get, reconfirmed in their thinking, that change could take place quickly. On the other hand, sort of I have, sort of good amount of hope that things are probably not going to get apocalyptic anytime soon, right? United States generally has had missteps in its policies, both domestic and foreign, fairly often, but responded to them and corrected them relatively quickly and efficiently in many ways. And so, from this perspective, to me, our primary threat here is the lack of fiscal discipline, right? Running extreme deficits that are in some cases comparable to the wartime deficit from World War II, while there is no war going on. So that process had been taking place no matter what party is in power, right? Republicans tend to profess fairly conservative economic views, but once they get in power, they still spend money like drunken sailors, just as much, sometimes more, sometimes less, compared to the Democratic Party as well. And so the clock there is ticking. So a couple of years ago, we were saying that there is, maybe no more than 20 years that the United States can continue on its current trajectory before that trajectory becomes irreversible, or where reversing that trajectory would require very significant and very painful adjustments. We're a couple of years into that 20-year period, right? Sort of, I think it's not unreasonable to say that, sort of 15 to 18 years, sort of not, they'll make a huge difference from us how we approach that. And I'd love to see the electorate start embracing that concept and start electing politicians that are fiscally conservative and who don't let the Leviathan grow continuously as it has in the past.
Oh, Ray Dalio in his book says that it's virtually impossible, even if there is a desire for that, nobody can bear the electoral unrest. And we saw it earlier, right? When Elon Musk with the president started cutting off unnecessary expenses, how much outcry it generated within a very short period of time, like calling various names, even Elon Musk. Right, so I don't think any politician can really bear that. So, and Ray Dalio says that there were no examples in history when it happened.
So I think the challenge there is that the approach that Musk's team took was very, very rough, right? Sort of, it was not necessarily terribly involved, right? Generally speaking, it's going to be very hard to give a bunch of 20 years old, sort of who just maybe graduated college or haven't graduated yet, the ability to cut down significant budgets. And, sort of the promise of significant savings that was made, right? It was overpromised and under-delivered, right? We haven't really seen much of the impact there. But, I mean, I'm still hopeful, right? I'm a lot more optimistic than Ray Dalio is. Sounds I might be a little more optimistic than you, right? That the United States will correct itself and that voters eventually will, probably after a crisis of some sort, will come together and elect politicians who will be a lot more fiscally conservative. I keep thinking back to, one of the tools that Germany used and that Germany institutionalized in its constitution, that idea of a debt brake, say that essentially says no, in order to run deficits, you can only do that for structural purposes and only in a limited, sort of like in limited ways, right? And sort of that for, sort of like for many reasons, basically it resulted in Germany potentially underspending on investment from the government side compared to what it should be spending. But, to me, that's a lesser evil compared to spending public money like a drunken sailor and continuing to borrow and borrow and borrow every year to finance those deficits. I'd rather go for the German style debt break in the constitution.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem to be in the card. The change in attitude of U.S. politicians,
Mm-hmm.
even Democrats, for example, under Biden, they had a very irresponsible fiscal policy,
Mm-hmm.
expanded the deficit tremendously. That $1,400 per person that Joe Biden provided had no justification.
Mm-hmm.
It's good for a bit of income redistribution, but in terms of the cost of the cost of created by the increase in debt,
Mm-hmm.
because the cost is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, increasing the defense budget or the war budget of the U.S. From about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion is really, it's going to increase the debt of the U.S. quite a bit. And the impact on credibility of U.S. government is going to be huge down the road. But the incentive to cut expenditures is very weak right now, and because they can borrow cheaply, they've continued to do it. And when the interest rate goes up, our current president says, lower the interest rates and don't impose additional costs on the government.
So it starts sounding more and more like Turkey, right? Where
Right.
President Erdogan, very much believes that high interest rates are not a cure for inflation, rather they're a cause of inflation, right? So, which is putting the proverbial cart way before the horse. Actually, maybe 20, 30 feet in front of the horse, if anything.
And if you look at the history of fiscal policy and politics in the U.S. in the past 3, 4, or 5 decades, anybody who has tried to be responsible in terms of fiscal policy has had a really hard time getting elected.
Mm-hmm.
Democrats lost the election in 2000 exactly because of their emphasis on fiscal discipline. They had generated a surplus and wanted to use the surplus to reduce debt or invest in infrastructure, etc. And they didn't get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Republicans promised to spend more and run more deficits, and they won the election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, it's a tough thing because in the short run, what's been working in the short run basically works against us in the long run, right? In terms of political choices. It will have to take quite an awakening by the American electorate to start electing those politicians.
Right.
All right, folks, any other questions or comments or ideas for future discussion topics? We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, professors.
Thank you, Vitaly. I appreciate your joining us. All right. Okay, it sounds like we're done today. So this was a relatively quick session. So we've gotten in under an hour, which is great. Usually we run for a little more than that. So thank you for joining us. Really appreciated to be connected to you and to see you all. And see you soon. See you next month.
I was late.
Yeah. And regarding
it's all good.
Yeah, and regarding future sessions, we saw so many questions from James and how much reaction they generate. So maybe maybe a session on how AI is going to transform the labor markets. And I know it's hard, but again, maybe
That's a
some
very good
ideas.
question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
also
that's
how AI is gonna transform the knowledge industry, including education system. I think
Mhm.
that will be a huge one. I intend to save the question for our next meeting with Professor Hadi. So,
okay. All right.
but, all right. Anyway, thank you guys. Appreciate that.
Thank you all. Thanks for
Bye,
joining us and
everyone.
talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you.